Trickster spirits and demons are a major feature of many mythologies and folklores throughout the world, and certainly this is true for Japan as well. Indeed, the Japanese have quite a selection of mischievous creatures and a huge variety of forms and behaviours across the archipelago. MHRise, being the latest game in the series and borrowing heavily from Japanese folklore, has its very own trickster, one prone to pelting both hunter and other monsters with fruit for its amusement and in displays of self-defense. With its curious ape-like body, prehensile tail, and parrot-like beak, the Bishaten certainly makes for a curious mashup of a monster. Personally, I'm not such a fan of the end result, but credit where credit is due, Capcom really put in a lot of effort into this monster and its equipment to reference a particular yokai from Japanese folklore and history, the Tengu. So, with this in mind, let's take a look at the folklore and the monster and find where legend becomes reality with the Bishaten. Of all yokai to have seen a change in their perception throughout time, the Tengu as a whole have easily had one of the most complex, from inception to the modern day. Like many yokai, they are actually an adaptation of a mythical creature not even from Japan, but rather from China. The Tengu is a fierce canine monster that frequently resembles a shooting star as it travels and creates a noise like thunder as it passes. And where it falls, war soon follows. Its most notable characteristic is one found in many cultures throughout the world, in that it's said to consume the moon and thus create eclipses, in the same vein of other creatures like Skoll and Hati from Norse mythology, and even the Egyptian Apep, the serpent that attempts to swallow Ra during the eclipse. The Tengu shares the same Chinese characters as the Japanese Tengu as well, and likely was brought over during the cultural exchanges during the early and Nara periods of Japanese history. The first mention of Tengu is from the 720 text, the Nihon Shoki. A shooting star is spotted and identified as a heavenly dog, and much like with the legend of the Tengu, not long after there is a military uprising, just to further the parallels between the two. For the next few centuries of the Heian period, Tengu held a largely antagonistic role, being enemies of Buddhism who abducted monks, possessed women to seduce them and lead them off the right path, and even robbed temples. At this time they took on the form of bird-like humanoids, deriving traits from birds like kites, rather than crows, like in their later legends, and rather than being mountain spirits, they were far more sinister in nature, being the ghosts of truly prideful and arrogant Buddhists who had fallen from Buddha's teachings. Vengeful and even living ghosts turn up a great deal in the writings of this time period, so perhaps it is not a surprise that this would be the origin for the Tengu of this period. Not even the emperors of Japan, the divinely appointed stewards of the land, were free of the potential fate of becoming a Tengu. The 75th emperor of Japan, Sutoku, was exiled by his father for a failed military coup and from then on led a monastic life and spent many years hand-copying sutras and scrolls, which were eventually sent to the capital of Kyoto. However, they were rejected for fear that they might be cursed. Spited, it is said that Sutoku bit off his own tongue and as he bled to death wrote out a curse against all of Japan and transformed into a Tengu. Plenty of historical disasters from the civil wars that eventually ended the rule of the emperors in the Heian period. Droughts and even earthquakes have been blamed on this curse. So great is the curse of Sutoku that the former emperors gained infamy and become one of the 3 most evil yokai in Japan, joining the likes of Shuten Doji, who was mentioned in the Gosarag video. These 3 yokai are the ones that came closest to destroying Japan, and seeing the damage inflicted by this curse on the rulers at the time, perhaps Sutoku was the one who actually succeeded. With time, however, the view on Tengu changed. While still fearsome, they gradually altered to become protectors of Buddhism and the forested mountains they're associated with, a change which is first really noticeable in the 17th century onwards. Today, Tengu are closely associated with Mount Kurama, north of Kyoto, and also with Shugendo, a religion that combines elements of Buddhism, Shintoism, and other folk beliefs that frankly I could dedicate an entire video to and fail to touch on many of its aspects. Indeed, so linked are Tengu to Shugendo now that most popular depiction of Tengu depict them as dressed not unlike the Yamabushi practitioners of this religion. So then, with that somewhat lengthy history taken care of, what exactly is a Tengu as far as we understand it today? Well, rather than being prideful ghosts, they are now perceived as mountain spirits that can be distinguished into 2 varieties. The first and lesser are the Kotengu, also known as the Karasu Tengu, which possess the wings and beaks of crows and are far more akin to their traditional depiction from the Heian era. Typically, these lower-ranking Tengu are the ones who pull tricks on humans both to teach a lesson when it's needed and for their own amusement. Above the Kotengu are the Dai Tengu, who still possess the wings of a bird, but rather than having a beak, they have a long nose, perhaps an anthropomorphization of the original beak. They also have very distinctive red faces, and if you've ever seen a mask of one of these yokai while searching the internet, you might recognize it now. This variety is almost always depicted as wearing the clothes of a Yamabushi from the Shugendo religion mentioned earlier, and they typically carry fans made of feathers, which possess magical powers capable of creating mighty winds or growing and shrinking a person's nose, of all things. Tengu are often ascribed great martial skill and ability. Sojobo, the king of the Tengu of Mount Kurama, supposedly taught Minamoto no Yoshitsune, one of Japan's greatest and most famous warriors and commanders, who helped successfully lead the rebellion that overthrew the emperors and installed the first shogunate of Japan. In this capacity, Tengu have been accredited as the teachers and founders of many Japanese martial arts and ways. Before we even look at Bishaten's physiology, behaviour and equipment, we need to look at its name, because by far the most blatant link is this creature's translated title, which is Tengu Beast. I hardly feel that I need to say more than this when it comes to a link between yokai and monster, to be honest. Furthermore, in its intro and ecology video, the title given to Bishaten at the end is Furious Ascetic, which references the ascetic nature and practice of many Buddhist sects like the Yamabushi. When we look at Bishaten itself, with an understanding of what a Tengu is and how they're often depicted, a lot of the oddities in its design begin to make more sense. The beak and bird-like traits are derived from the Kotengu, and their fusion with the ape-like body structure of the rest of the monster creates a blend that more directly resembles the yokai even further. This is only enhanced by the shape of the Bishaten's tail, which is a direct reference to the Dai Tengu and the fan it carries in its legends. The Bishaten's preference for fruit, despite its omnivory, is quite possibly a reference and allusion to the nature of a Buddhist diet, certainly the variety that's practiced in Japan. Being a country that primarily follows the Mahayana canon of Buddhist teachings, in which it's prohibited to eat meat as an effort to avoid causing harm and death to living things, Japanese monks like those bedeviled or protected by the Tengu follow this. The Japanese even have a name for this form of cuisine, and translates roughly to devotion food rather fittingly. Now, this next bit might be me stretching a little bit, so please do take what I say with a pinch of salt. But in this diet, it's considered essential that the foods consist of 5 flavours and 5 colours, those being white, green, yellow, black and red. Perhaps the Bishaten eating and making use of fruit of 3 of these colours comes from this very particular and sacred diet. As said, it's possibly conjecture. It might be a bit of game design to help differentiate the fruit that is soon to hit your hunter in the face and inflict a status ailment, but I certainly hope it is a reference. With regards to Bishaten's use of fruit, its use of them for both self-defense and trickery alongside plain for consumption is rather odd. Few creatures in nature actively make use of their food source as a weapon, and the fact that Bishaten shows a degree of what in humans would be mirth or amusement may relate back to the Kotengu and its nature as a trickster. The game's director has said in an interview that the direct inspiration for this behaviour came from the tale of the monkey and the crab, in which, to cut the story short, a tricky monkey pelts a crab with unripe persimmons like the sort Bishaten eats, until the crab dies, and subsequently its children get revenge for it in a somewhat convoluted way. However, Tengu also throw objects, specifically rocks, at those who are wicked, a story historically used to explain the random ripples that occur in lakes or the sound of a rock hitting the ground when you are the only one around. This behavioural phenomenon is called Tengu Subute, and frequently after experiencing it, people suffer illness or misfortune. It might simply be coincidence or for gameplay's sake, but I would say getting stunned, flashed, or poisoned by Bishaten's fruit is quite a bit of misfortune for the player as well. Let's take a look at Bishaten's parts, because only one of them really relates in some way to the Tengu. This is the Bichaten Horn, by the way, and reads, Bichaten Horn, resembling a monk's hat. Wearing it makes you smarter, supposedly. When you imagine the sort of hat a Japanese monk might wear, many of you who know anything about Japan and its approach to Buddhism might think of the Komuso group of monks, who wear distinctive tengai hoods that almost look like upturned baskets. However, in this case I believe the hat being referenced is the more obscure token, which is a small red or black box worn on the foreheads of Yamabushi, and also by Tengu. It helps that the part of the head this horn is positioned on, both the monster and the hunter once you create it, corresponds to where the token is worn. When we look at the equipment we can make from Bishaten parts, things get really interesting, as all of them are either a direct reference to Tengu or a link to Buddhism in some way, much like with the yokai itself. Now, whilst looking over some of them there is no direct link at all, but I will be discussing their Buddhist links for completeness, and in case any sharp-eyed viewers might spot something I miss, and if you do, please do comment and let me know. It's been quite fascinating to learn about them. It would be best to start not with a particular item, but rather with a motif. As mentioned before, fans turn up in a lot of art about Tengu, particularly the Dai Tengu. Both weapons for the Palico and Palamute are 5-pointed fans in reference to this, and in their descriptions reference the legends of Tengu using their fans to spirit people away with powerful gusts of wind, with the Palicos going as far to say that it was gifted by alpine or mountain spirits. It's not just your companion's weapons either. The shield that's part of the sword and shield made with Bishaten parts, the exercising blade, also calls on this motif. Now, on to armour. When we look at the Bishaten helm, it mentions that it is worn by those who train deep in mountains, whilst the vembraces and greaves both mention guiding one's way through shadowy mountain glens and assisting a mountaineer in search of enlightenment. Both of these relate to the Yamabushi and mountain ascetics, not unlike those on Mount Kurama where Tengu features so very heavily in legends. Two of them specifically speak of enlightenment and illumination, referencing not just the physical journeys such people take part in, but also the spiritual. The other two pieces of armour, the mail and greaves, relate more closely to the Tengu. The mail refers to ancient mountain deities that protect you from evil, recalling how Tengu, at least more recently, whilst often tricksters and malevolent in their early descriptions, are also guardians and educators of the worthy. The Bishaten coil mentions that it grants wings to ride the wind and soar over hills, perhaps a bit more of a metaphorical reference to the Tengu, or the freeing of the mind through Buddhist practice. With our companion's armour, both for the feline and canine sets, both have the same small horn on the head that is so much like the token hat of the Yamabushi. Both sets also mention that the armour is either inspired by or blessed by alpine spirits, which is fair to make the comparison to Tengu once more, seeing the prevalent themes so far. When it comes to weapons, there's certainly a lot to look into, although only one of them relates directly to the Tengu. The 5-pronged hammer is directly based off the Vara, an object sacred in both Hinduism and Buddhism that symbolises thunder and indestructibility. In Hinduism, the Vara is the sacred weapon of Indra, the god of rain and thunder, who used a Vara made from the bones of a notable sage to slay a dragon that had swallowed all the world's water by the name of Vritra. This sacred symbol was passed into Buddhism as well. One of the 3 main schools of Buddhism even takes the Vara as its symbol and source of its name, the Vajrayana school of Buddhism. As a tool, the Vara has multiple uses and meanings in Buddhism, but often implies the thunderbolt-like realization of enlightenment and the obliteration of delusion and obstacles in one's way, and its 5 prongs are associated with the 5 poisons that obscure the path to enlightenment, and also the 5 wisdoms that are the key features of the enlightened mind. The links do not even stop here. The description of the 5-pronged hammer and its upgrade mentions both protecting those free of greed and obliterating obstacles in the path of the wielder. Quite the potent object, it seems. What about the exercising sword and shield, though? Well, we already talked about the fan feather motif, so let's focus on the blade for now. The sword from this weapon looks a great deal like the same one wielded by wrathful Buddhist deities, who destroy obstacles and protect communities and individuals from outside threats. The sword looks almost exactly like that of Akala, also known in Japan as Fudo Myo, complete with the double prongs on the blade and 3 on the bottom that perhaps resemble one end of a vara. The excising blade mentions in the weapon's description that the sword, like that of Akala's, is capable of dispelling evil, and its final form, the Xiaocha pure blade, in this case Xiaocha meaning purity and clearness, refers to purity of the mind and body. Interestingly, the description for the pure blade mentions that the weapon will serve a noble guardian who is true of heart, linking back to the exercising blade resembling the sacred swords of wrathful deities and guardians of Buddhist temples. Seeing the role of Tengu in more recent ages as protectors of Buddhism, perhaps it's a nice link back. Both the wheel axe and the dawn ray bow share one common linking factor in their design, and that's the existence of this golden 8-spoked wheel. To Western audiences this might only call to mind something like a wheel of a cart, but to Asian religions this is an incredibly ancient and sacred symbol, the Dharma Chakra. In Buddhism, the Dharma Chakra represents the Noble Eightfold Path, 8 parts of the path to liberation from the wheel of samsara and suffering. Taken together, the development and perfection of these 8 paths are essential in Buddhist training and teaching, improving ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom all at the same time. With this in mind, this is not the first time we've seen this symbol in Monster Hunter, as another heavily Buddhist-inspired monster had equipment with the Dharma Chakra as part of it. Speaking of symbols, the lotus is one that's very important in East Asian religions. In Buddhism, the ability of these flowers to grow in muddy, coloured water and still become beautiful blossoms represents the human condition on the path to enlightenment, in that no matter how one starts in life through hard work and self-improvement, all souls can achieve enlightenment. With this in mind, looking at the Lotus Bow Gun, we can of course see the lotus flower prominently placed along the barrel, and the weapon's description relates to the lotus and its symbolism with enlightenment and salvation as well. Furthermore, there's actually another link to Buddhism in this weapon, as nestled in the lotus flower is what would appear to be a single-story pagoda of the Southeast Asian style, not unlike those found in Thailand and Cambodia. Finally, looking at the last of the Bishaten's weapons, the High Priest Bow Gun is based off a kakara, also known as a shakujo in Japan, which is a staff adorned with rings and an object frequently seen in association with Buddhist monks. The rings, when moving, create sound intended to announce a monk's coming and to scare and warn away animals. This is the dual purpose of warning away animals like tigers so that the faithful will be safe from predators on the road, and also scaring away smaller ones that might be crushed under a faithful's foot and thus compromise their vows to cause no harm to living creatures. With this in mind, the protective traits of the High Priest Bow Gun and Bishaten's grace may call on this imagery, and the mention of the latter specifically being protected by compassion may call upon the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, who is often depicted with a kakara in one of their 1,000 arms. Well, that was quite a long video for me so far. I hope you have enjoyed learning not only about the Tengu and its link to Bishaten, but about Buddhism as well. It is rather impossible to discuss Bishaten's weapons without going quite into depth on the topic, and whilst only a few directly relate to the Tengu, I felt it worth discussing. Whilst Bishaten is not my favourite new monster in Rise, the inspiration and references involved in it to the Tengu is something I can definitely get behind, so good job Capcom. Please let me know if you have enjoyed the video, and subscribe if you have interest in seeing future videos about the yokai origins of various Monster Hunter monsters. But until then, happy hunting everyone!